Hey guys, in this video we will be looking at implementing an Ajax form for our application. Now, the reason we would use an Ajax form, which is a JavaScript mechanism, is to reduce the number of reloads for our pages. Now, do recall that when we're creating an enrollment, we want to dynamically search for a student, which is why we implemented here a jQuery UI autocomplete widget in our text box. And to add to this functionality, what we will be doing is implementing what we call an Ajax form. Now, an Ajax form will actually reduce the need for us to refresh in between clicking our submit button. Do recall that every time we click create, it actually is set up in the controller to navigate to our list. What we want to do is allow the user to continuously enter and enter and enter on this one page without needing to navigate away and come back. So that is where the Ajax form will play a huge advantage. Now, the first thing that we will want to do is actually include some jQuery libraries, and we will do this through NuGet. So we will go over to our project, right click, and go to manage NuGet packages. Because we don't have them installed, we will actually go to browse and we will look for jQuery unobtrusive Ajax. So we can just type, I guess we can just type Ajax. And just by typing Ajax, the top result is our library that we're looking for. So Microsoft.jQuery unobtrusive Ajax. So we can just go ahead and click install and allow NuGet to do its thing. All right, and with the success of that, we can just confirm in our scripts folder that we now have jQuery.unobtrusive-Ajax. So those are the two new files that we expect to see after NuGet has completed its installation. The next thing we want to modify is our bundle config. So we want to create a new bundle for our new script files. Now I'm just duplicating this jQuery line. I named it jQuery-Ajax, and instead of trying to retype this, I just copied the name from the file here in Source Explorer and just pasted it to expedite that whole typing process. After saving this line to our bundle config, then we want to let our layout page know that there is a new bundle in town. So I'll just include it underneath our jQuery line. So remember, order matters. As long as it's underneath the jQuery line, then you should have no problem. So jQuery-Ajax is our new bundle that needs to be rendered. Now we can head back to our create view and then we'll start our modifications. So the first thing we want to do is change the type of form. So we would see that we're using HTML.begin form, meaning we're using a regular HTML form. The new type of form in town is Ajax. So I'll say Ajax right here, replacing HTML, and we're beginning our Ajax form. All right, so we're seeing that Ajax has a little error underneath it, and that's chiefly because our Ajax form actually takes a few parameters. So we'll go ahead and fill in these parameters, and I'll walk you through it step by step. The first parameter is the post action. So the thing is, when the Ajax form submits, it needs to know what in the controller should I be calling. All right, so we all know that the HTML form by default will call the post action of whatever is in the controller. So we have the create here, which renders the form initially. And then once you click submit, it's automatically going to look for the HTTP post version of create. However, with the Ajax form, and even with the HTML form, but it's required for the Ajax form, we need to specify what action should be called. So I could specify that I want to call create, but then I'm going to modify it a bit and I'm going to create another one and then we'll write that action together. So I'm going to call this one add student. Next up, we need to specify which controller is this action in. So it's the enrollment controller. And then we need to add new Ajax options. And I'll just break the line here so that we can just fill it out within full view. Now, the options are more like properties of this new class. So you notice that this is getting the color coding from Visual Studio that it's a class. So we're just adding values and certain properties that are called Ajax actions. So the first one that we're going to add is the HTTP method. And to date, we've been using post. So we can just maintain that. So we just specify that we want to post. And then we can say on success, we wish to do a certain action, and I'll call it added. All right. So upon success of this post call, then we want to call this function, and another one on failure, we want to do this one. There are quite a few properties that you can actually implement in the Ajax options section. And I have attached a document to this lecture stating each of those options and how you can leverage them. The next thing we want to do is implement our new function called add student, or well, our new action called add student, and we'll just come over into our controller and I will add it below the existing post create function. So like we stated, this is going to be an HTTP post. And all I did just now, in case this is the first you're seeing it, I typed the word prop and then press tab twice. And that just implements a property, but it's a quicker way to just get public, and you can just set in the type you wish. And this is not a property, of course, this is actually a function. And then we are creating the post action add student. And of course, add student is going to take a parameter, or a parameter similar to the existing create. But then do recall that we're expecting only two values really and truly from this form. And in previous lectures, we would have seen that actually what this does is omit any field that is coming across. So if the field is not listed here, then it won't be included in our model. So we're going to use that, but then we're actually going to specify exactly what fields we want, which are the course ID and the student ID. Those are the two fields that really should be coming from this form. So for this parameter, I'm just going to borrow this code quickly, since it's very similar, except I'm actually just going to specify that I want only the course ID and the student ID, since nothing else is really being added from this form. Now for this action, I'm actually going to do a try and catch. So I just type try and then double tab, and then it filled out the rest of that code block for me. And then we can start filling out our code. So I'm going to follow this pattern because a lot of the code that was generated for us is still applicable. The model state is valid is checking, is there any missing data? So between the two values that we're expecting, which are course ID and student ID, is either of them missing in this scenario? And then if it is valid, then we expect to add the record and return the view. So I'm just going to copy that and place that in my try block. And actually, I'm going to modify this just to look like this. So I'm going to make it into an asynchronous method. So I just put async and then task and wrap this. So focusing on the simple and lower hanging fruits of this block of code, what I'm going to do is say try to do this operation, and if it fails, then take this action. So let's first work on the part that does not fail. So if the model state is valid, then we want to add the enrollment, save the changes, but then you notice that the return type here is wrong, because what we need to do is return a JSON similar to how we returned it in, where's that function? Right, so we had a JSON result function here, and we returned a JSON object. So we need to do something similar for this, since it is a JSON result. We're going to modify this action to be a JSON object that is being returned. And then do recall that with JSON objects, you can actually specify the contents of these objects to suit your needs. So I'm going to specify a custom object that has two parameters. The first one is going to be is success, which I intended to be a Boolean. So I'm going to say true, because if the model state is valid and all of this works out, then it was a success. So I'm passing back a Boolean to say is success is true. And also I'm adding a message that I intend to display to my users. So I'm going to say student added successfully. And then following the pattern of our previous JSON function, I'm just going to pass the JSON request behavior allow get parameter so that our JSON object is complete. So let me just review this. We're trying this operation, And if the model state is valid, then we're going to go ahead and add the enrollment, add it to the database, and then return a success status with a success message. So that will let our form know. Remember, we just implemented this. Our form will know, based on what is returned, that it was either a success or a failure. So we have the success scenario, we need to put in the failure scenario. So for our failure line, we can actually just copy this because it would be a very similar thing. And this would be outside of this if statement because this only gets done if it is valid. And then you'll see people flip this around. Maybe you will flip it around to say, if not valid, then return the failure. But then if it is valid, then do some other stuff. So it's up to you, but I'm going to leave this as is. And so if it is valid, then it was successful. And if it does not return, or if this fails, then it will default to this line. So if it defaults to this line, which means that the model state is not valid, then we return a failure status. So our is success would actually be false. And our message would read differently, maybe student was not added successfully. So if it was added successfully, then we expect our JSON object to have a true for this value and this message. Otherwise, it should return this. And in the same vein, if an exception is thrown, or an exception is caught rather, then what we want to do is not throw, because throwing actually crashes our application, but we want to handle it gracefully. So if you're not so familiar with a try catch, what this does, once again, it tries this operation, and if that entire operation fails anywhere, then it catches the exception. So then you can say, okay, if there's an exception or an overall error that was unaccounted for, how do I handle it? The line throw makes the program crash. In this scenario, we don't want our program to crash. We want the user to just have the same kind of experience as they would have had if it was an invalid entry. Then we want to just show them that it failed. So we can just reuse this is success line and say something different, and probably, so we want to tell them to please contact your administrator, and then we can probably put in details of the error. You probably don't want to show them actual details of the error since they're just end users. But if you're more advanced, then you can probably put in like an email to fire off to the administrator or the webmaster when an exception is caught, so that you can keep abreast of the happenings of the software. Now, there's one more thing I want to add to this validation before it actually goes ahead and adds a student, and that is a check to see if the student is already enrolled in a particular course. So what we're doing is allowing somebody from our create view, we're allowing somebody to select a course and then type a student's name and then click submit. And then it will call this function, passing in the course ID and the student's ID, and then try to add them. What we don't want is a situation where the same student is being added to the same course more than once. That we're going to put in a validation here, and I'm going to add that validation to this if statement. So I'm just going to write a quick bit of code, which is going to query our database. So I'm going to say var is enrolled is equal to, and then I can say db.enrollments, and then I'm going to use another link function, which is called any, which really just says, is there any record in the database that meets a particular condition? So as it stands, any is going to say, is there any record inside this table? So I'm going to build on this any function with our lambda expression. So I'm using Q, which is our universal letter for lambda expressions, and I'm checking if there is any course ID in our enrollments table that matches the course ID coming from our enrollment model. Here's our enrollment model coming in through our parameter, and I'm saying, is there any course ID in this table that is the same as this course ID, which I'm sure would be yes by now, right? If you have entered a few records, then there should be at least one record, maybe not. But this would return true. But this is not all we're interested in, because we want to know that there is a course ID that matches this, and in that same record where we found a match, that there is a student ID that matches our enrollment. So this line, once again, is saying, please tell me if there is any record in my enrollments table where the course ID and the student ID match the course ID and student ID coming in through this JSON request or this post request to this action in this model object. So then we want to say if is enrolled, then we don't want to add them. So I mean, this is saying is enrolled. So I can just add, amend this condition on the if statement to say if the state is valid, meaning both properties that are required for the form are there, and is enrolled is equal to false. All right. So if it is valid and the student is not enrolled, then we can proceed. So if either one of these evaluates to not being true, then it should post that the student was not added successfully. And we can amend this and say student is already added. So student is already enrolled. So it's good to have descriptive messages for each step so that they know exactly what is happening and probably why it failed. So I can amend this and say system failure. Once again, you probably don't want to tell your users that there's a system failure. You can find a nice, graceful message to put there, but I'm just giving you the scenarios as they come up and helping you to appreciate why we have customized messages for each state. So once again, we're saying we're checking the enrollment table to see if there's any record that has both course ID and student ID existing before our current action. And if there is none, then we just say, okay, return that it was successful. If there is, or if one of these values is missing, then we return a false with a failure. And if there is an error in doing any of this up here, then we're going to catch the exception and just return an error message saying that there's a failure without crashing our program. Now I'm just going to amend this line a bit. And I said it this way to spell it out for in case you're new to C# and you're not fully familiar. But then we can actually just say if is not enrolled. So this actually evaluates to the same thing that was there just now. So if you prefer to write it this way, and this way looks a bit shorter, but then, you know, as a beginner, you may not absorb it as quickly as how I had it before, but I'm just showing you that it can be written either way. So we're just going to build and make sure that we have no errors. We can run our project, and I'm setting a breakpoint here at our add student action so that we can see that when we click submit, the data is actually being passed to this function. So I'm just going to do a quick test here, and I'm just going to change the drop down property, and I'm not even going to put in a student, and we'll just see how this behaves. So I'm going to click create. And we see that our breakpoint is active. If I hover over my enrollment model, we'll see that we have the course ID coming back and nothing coming back for our student ID. So if I step through the code and I stepped until I got to the if statement, so it ran the query and this returned false because there is no enrollment that exists with course ID being 4 and student ID being 0. And then I will continue to step, and then you see that it skipped over this if statement altogether because the model state is not valid because there is no value being provided for student ID, which is required based on our design. So it hits our JSON object, which is returning that there is a failure in the addition of the student. And there is a message that says, okay, the student is already enrolled. And so sometimes this may not tell the whole story, right? So be very careful with your message because in this case, it's not a lack of enrollment, or it's not the presence of an existing enrollment, but it's the lack of valid data. So you want to be very clear when you have that message. Anyhow, we can just press F5 and continue. And then we look back at our web page and we see that we didn't even navigate away. And I'm going to put in a student this time. So I'm going to type for one of the students. So our type ahead is still working. And then I'll click create. And then we hit the breakpoint once again. And if we look in our object, we see that we're getting back a student ID and a course ID. And I am just going to set the breakpoint to the if statement quickly. Press F5. And then we're hitting our if statement. And we see here this time the model state is true because it is getting back two valid values for course ID and student. And also is enrolled is false. So there is no conflict as to where this block of code should go afterwards. So if I step in And I'll just skip ahead. I'll just set another breakpoint and just press F5. And then you see that it flashed on the screen because it did this, then it did that. And then because none of this failed, it went to this success portion. And it is saying the student is added successfully like we designed it to say. And once again, if any of this operation failed, what would have happened is that it would have jumped to the catch and then returned that JSON false also. So I can just press F5 and continue. And you see that the page didn't move. Nothing changed on the page. Like that's at this stage, it's good and bad. All right, but when I go back to the list, I see here that the enrollment that I just did was successful. And yes, we're going to modify this page because as it stands, as it is, it's not very clear. We have mismatching columns and poor data. So this is going to be modified soon, but I want us to focus on the fact that the enrollment was added for calculus and the student Tajay Reed, and the page itself did not redirect. I had to manually go back to the list to see it. All right, so that means our Ajax form is working as we intended. So if I look for another student, I had one named Ann Ledford, and I click create, and I'm just going to take off my breakpoints at this point because I'm sure it's working. And then I just continue, and the page didn't refresh, the page didn't do anything, but then I have to go back to the list and refresh, and then it will yield that that was also a successful enrollment. And then if I click create again, having already enrolled Ann Ledford in calculus, and I click create, you see nothing is happening, right? Well, nothing is happening visibly. So with our breakpoints, we would have seen that it hits the code and it would have evaluated to false because this enrollment already exists. And in the same way, if I refresh this list, then you'll see that this is not repeating itself no matter how many times we click to create. So now that we're sure that our code works, what we need to do is actually help the user to be sure that the code is working, because like I said at the beginning, there are no visual cues here to say, oh, it was successful or it was a failure. Now, do recall back in our form, we had specified certain options for on success and on failure. And then we only put in text here, but I didn't quite explain at the time what the text meant. So these are actually functions or names of functions that should be called when it's successful and when there's a failure. So these functions will actually be implemented in JavaScript. So we have here the script block. I don't have to create a new one. I'll just use it and I'll declare a new function in JavaScript. So you just say function and you give it the name. And I said on success, I want the function added to be called. And then remember that we're actually returning a JSON object here. So this is a new object that has two properties, is success and message. So I'm going to prepare my function for the prospect of getting some response from the JSON call. So I'm just using the word res or resource, response, whatever it is you want to call it. So that's what I'm calling it. So once this has finished processing and it got the callback or the response, then it calls the function added. I am letting added know that I expect it to house an object in which is going to correspond with whatever it is I'm returning. So res here is going to embody the properties is success and message. So I'm just going to quickly implement this, and I'm going to put in an if statement and say if res dot is success, then we want to use a jQuery function. So the $ really invokes a jQuery call, and this function, I want it to render some HTML element. So I'm going to render an element that I'm going to call success. I'm calling it by ID. I'm calling it success, and I'm going to tell it to fade in fast. So that's one of those jQuery things. So jQuery makes JavaScript a bit, easier and faster to implement. If you were to write vanilla JavaScript to accomplish something like this, then it would probably take a few more lines of code. So jQuery actually expedites that whole process of getting some interactivity in our application. And then I'm just going to copy this code and I'm going to implement another function and call it failed. And I'm just going to modify this if statement and say, if not, then I want failed to fade in fast. So I want on success, an element called, on a successful add, then we want an element called success to fade in. And if it fails, then we want an element called failed to fade in. All right, so after adding these guys, I just realized that I would have misled you with something, and I'm going to explain what it is after I show you the code. So I added the divs for success and failed. And if we scroll down, I just created one div for failed, and I gave it the ID failed, of course, so that we could target it using the hashtag. And also I gave it the class alert and alert danger from our bootstrap so that a red box will come up and display our error. So what I did here was, instead of using the message coming from our JSON response about whether the student was added or not, and then trying to find a reason, I just gave a wholesale error right here in static text to say there was an error adding the student to this course, and you could say, please check your data and try again, or contact your administrator. You can explain whatever it is you want here in one big general text. And also for success, I put in the message student added successfully. So what will happen is that on success, we call added, and then added is going to check if the success message is actually true, and then render this function. If we wanted to add the text coming back from the JSON, we could just append the text here in using JavaScript to this element, because res would have res.message just like it has res.success. So we could have just said we want the element success and we want to append, and what we want to append is res.message. So that is how you would actually go about fitting that actual error message or success message coming from our JSON response into the contents of the div. So if you don't want to do it this way where you have the static text in the div, then you can do it this way where you just inject it in. So I'm just showing you both ways. I usually just put in the static text, but I'll leave that there for your future reference. Now, when I said I would have misled you, I got a bit overzealous and would have told you that on failure corresponds with the JSON response, and that was inaccurate. So on failure actually means that if the call to the action fails for whatever reason, meaning this was not successful, it made the Ajax call and it couldn't find this, then what error do you want to show? So this function would actually get called if there was a total system failure when trying to call the post action. So that's what on failure really means. So whether or not on the database side, the addition of the record was successful, or if in this case, the way we wrote our application, if there was an exception trying to do this operation and it caught a response, as long as it's returning a response, the Ajax form sees it as a successful call because it sent data and it got back a response. So really and truly, to facilitate this failed versus success scenario for the addition of our properties, for the addition of our enrollments to our database, then we need to do it a bit differently. So I'm going to say failure here, right? And I mean, I can implement a function for this, but I don't anticipate, at least for this scenario, that I'm going to have a total system failure. But what I'm going to do is actually modify the added function. So on success, what do we want to do? And we call added. Now, added is the reason we're checking for is success is that success can be either true or false, because we got back a response and it's either true or false. So if it is true, then we want to display our div called success. And then I can say else. So else meaning res.success is not true. Then we can call our other function, which I outlined, failed, and it's passing in the res. So just the same way we could target that div for success and put in the text, we can target this div. So I'll just leave that there for your future reference. Once again, I put in the static text here. So I'm not going to use this, but feel free to experiment. And so for the added, if this is not successful, and really and truly, I don't have to do two if statements So if it's not successful, then I want to call failed rest. So I'm going to take out that block of code. And then what I want to do is just call this function from our else section. So it's either successful and it got added and it's a success, or failed to add, that is to the database. And so we're going to display #failed div, which is a div with alert danger. So if it was successful, then we see alert success. And this is where you start seeing how Bootstrap makes it easy for you to display visual cues to your users with very little effort. So once again, on failure really means that if it attempted to make the post call to this action and it couldn't find the action, maybe renamed it, or it just really couldn't communicate with the server, then that is when you call failure. So you could implement another function for failure. All right. So back in debug mode, we're going to test the theory that our code works. So once again, on a successful addition of an enrollment, then we expect that we're going to see a div appear and fade in, so a little animation, and you can adjust the speed, and you can just check jQuery documentation to see the different speed options. You can say slow, fast, and I think you can say medium. I'm not sure of the mid-range. And in the same way, if it fails, then we expect to see a red div to display our failure. So let us just try that. So I'm going to try the fail scenario first. So I'm just going to click create, and obviously this should fail. And there we go. So it faded in. There was an error adding the student to this course because we have a course ID and we didn't specify a student. And then I'm going to try and add an refer to, let's say, ASP.NET MVC validation. And then we click create. And there we go. So we see a little chink in our code now where we have two divs being displayed simultaneously, which is not necessarily what we want. And, it's not ideal. So let's modify our code a bit. So I'm going to say, all right, so the modification I made is to say that if something is added successfully, then we want to fade out failed, or you could just set its display to false, however you want to do it. I mean, there are many ways you could do that. So we're just saying fade out quickly and fade in the success. And if it fails, then we want to fade this in quickly. You just want to know that when it fails, you're not seeing the success div and vice versa. So we can save our changes here and then try that again. So I'm going to try create. This failed. All right, so I'm going to try and add to data mining, and there we go. So it's only displaying one at a time. So if I remove this and click create, then you see that it replaces the arrow with the success and vice versa. So we've essentially added an Ajax form and added a nice clean way to allow people to add students and enroll them to a class. However, as much as we've done quite a bit of work here, the work is still not finished because we still want a more interactive way for them to keep track of who is in what course. Meaning, in order to see who was added, we have to go back to our enrollments listing over here, and we have to look, and then we see the course, but then everything is mixed up. Yes, we can do some querying modifications to make it ordered by the course title and so on, but it's still kind of mixed up. So in the next video, what we will do is modify this. So we'll modify our labels, of course, and we'll also modify this entire create view that based on the course that is selected, we will see a table below here with all of the students in that course. And when we change this, it will refresh that view or that portion of this view and show only the students relative to which course is selected from this drop down. Also, when we add a student successfully, we expect to see them reflected in that list immediately.